The first thing we need to discuss is how to implement a private property in JavaScript. There are basically a few different techniques for doing this. I've covered them in one of my courses called Object-Oriented Programming in JavaScript. But in this lesson, I'm going to show you a very simple way to implement a private property in JavaScript. So here in the source folder, let's add a new file called custom store.js. Now here we want to declare a function called create store, just like the create store function of Redux. When we call this function, we get a store object. So this function should return an object with a few properties like getState, dispatch, and subscribe. Now in this function, we want to declare a variable called state. This variable should store the internal state of the store, okay? Now we don't want to add this variable in this object. We don't want to expose it because otherwise we'll be able to directly modify or mutate the internal state of the store. Let me show you what I mean by this. So in this file, I'm going to call the create store function. This returns an object, so we can export it as a default object. Now, let's go to the index.js. I'm going to delete all this code. We don't need it anymore. So let's import our store object from the custom store module. Now, let's log store.state so we can directly read this property, but we can also modify it. Take a look. So now the internal state is 1 because we directly mutated it. This is not what we want. So back to our custom store. Let's remove this variable from this object. Instead, we're going to declare a function called getState. In this function, we're going to return the value of the state variable. Now, a few things you need to pay attention to here. One is that in JavaScript, we can declare a function inside of another function. Because as I told you before, functions are first-class citizens. So there is no difference between declaring a variable and a function. So just like we can declare a variable here, we can also declare a function inside of another function, okay? The second thing you need to understand here is that in this function, we can access the variables that are defined here. So that is why we can return the state variable, okay? Now we're going to expose this function. So we add it to this object, getState. Now, in object-oriented programming terms, we say the store object has a method called getState. So when a function is part of an object, we say it's a method of that object, okay? So save the changes. Now back in index.js, let's delete this code and do a console.log of store.getState. So save the changes. We get undefined because we didn't initialize this variable, and by default, uninitialized variables are undefined, okay? Now, in index.js, what if we set store.state to 1? Let's see what we get on the console. We still get undefined because with this statement, we're essentially adding a new property in the store object called state. This state property is different from the state variable inside this function. So let's log the store object and see what we have. So the store object has two properties. One is the state property, which we dynamically added here, and the other is the getState method that we returned from the create store function, okay? So this is a very simple technique for implementing a private property in JavaScript. So we declare a variable in this function, and instead of exposing this variable in the object that is returned from this function, we create a function. We refer to this function as a getter because with this function, we can get the value of that variable. So then we'll expose this function in the object that is returned from this function, okay? So we're done with the first step. Next, we're going to implement dispatching actions.